Hey YouTube, welcome. How y'all doing? Lance here on a cruise. We're on the Vista, on the Carnival Vista. We're currently heading to Montego Bay. You can see the water in the background. Give you a little bit of a shot of the sky here. Give you a little bit here. Part of the boat. See if I can get y'all down there at the bottom. We're up on the 9th deck right here. Later on today, I might have a little surprise. We're working with the brewery on the boat. Is going to give us a tour, maybe in a couple of days. I'll see if I can carry you guys along on it. See y'all then. Welcome back to Ugly Duckling Brewing. We got a special guest for you guys today. I'm on the Carnival Vista, and I'm here with Robert today, which is here. He's the head brewer for Carnival for Vista. Am I saying that right?
Yep, that's correct.
So in a minute here, we're going to take a tour on their brew and show you pieces of it. I highly suggest you guys. I've seen them twice already. It's a great tour. You'll need to come out and check them out. Rob, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Rob Carter. I work for obviously Carnival Cruise Lines. Currently, I'm on the Carnival Vista. Most likely going to be on Carnival Jubilee coming up early next year once it gets to Galveston. Like he was saying, we have a brewery tour on the sea days. It's depending on like the football schedule, but right now we don't have one on the first sea day, second sea day, and last sea day. But we kind of let the guys run it as they want.
Got it. Listen, guys, it's an amazing tour. Y'all got to come out and see this guy. He's amazing. He's funny. He makes it fun. It's really educational. He knows his stuff. So y'all come out and see him. Y'all have a good day, and we'll check out the tour. See y'all in a bit.
Take it easy, guys. We're going to talk a little bit about how Carnival got started making beer and why in the world we ever put breweries on a cruise ship. First, though, I'm going to tell you a bit about myself, and then we're going to learn a little bit about you guys. But the most important thing is the entire time we're going to drink beer. Is everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
Yay! So, with that said, our first beer that we're going to drink today is the Thirsty Frog Red. Everybody say hi, Danny. Hi, Danny. Yay for Danny. So this is probably our most popular beer that we make on the ship, not only because it is the lightest and most approachable beer other than the seasonal, but regularly on the menu, this is the lightest and most approachable beer. You can think of this kind of like a more crafty version of Yingling. But it's also the most popular beer on the ship because it's the oldest beer Carnival's been brewing. It's our longest standing brand. So most people are more aware of this brand. Does that make sense to you guys? Cool. Last thing I want to make sure you guys are all aware of before we get started is I just want to make sure you understand the tour is not free. It is $30 a person unless you're on the Cheers package. And then you get a discount with the Cheers package. Say yay! What you're going to get for that funding, though, is I'm going to feed you all the beer you possibly want to drink. I'm then going to give you some extra stuff at the end. Is that very cool with that?
Yeah.
Awesome. My name is Robert Lee Carter II. Yes, I'm aware that's a very southern name. I come from a very small town in North Florida called Keystone Heights. There's absolutely nothing in Keystone Heights. It's one of those little one-stop light towns. If you blink, you miss it. And if I were you, just blink. There's nothing going on. There's nothing there but meth heads and trailer parks, right? So about 10 years ago, I moved to Central Florida, a little town called Lakeland, right between Orlando and Tampa. And that's where I got started making beer. I started at a large craft contract brewery in Lakeland called Brew. And the business model at Brew is that they make beer for other people. So what was your name, sir?
Dan.
Dan. Let's say Dan opens a brewery. Say yay, Dan. So Dan makes a beer that he can no longer meet the public demand for. You did a really good job and you made one beer that people just buy the crap out of. And you can no longer meet the public demand. You've got three options now. The first option is you can lose profit. Do you want to lose profit? The second option is you can reinvest a whole bunch more capital and build a bigger brewery with bigger brewing capacity. And a lot of times folks don't want to do that early in their business model. Your third option is you can farm out your production to someplace like Brew Hub, and that way you get paid and I get paid and all the people get beer. Does that make sense to y'all? Yeah. You ever heard of Cigar City Brewing out of Tampa, Florida? Yeah. Or Decorah, Iowa has Toppling Goliath, or Parrish out of Louisiana has Ghost in the Machine. You ever eat out of BJ's Brew House? Yeah. All those places use Brew Hub for their production capacity beer. I then went to Yingling for about a year. That's why I can attest that this beer is very similar to Yingling, because I made Yingling for a long time. I went to Yingling for only about a year. That was a soul-sucking, horrible production job. So I left it and I went back to Brew as the director of brewing operations. And then I now work on a cruise ship making beer. Yay! Now, let me put a little bit of a great definition on this. When I say soul-sucking, horrible production job, what I mean by that is like I started in craft beer with a lot of creative liberty and doing like really fun stuff, and then I went to a production brewery as Yingling, and I made the same thing every day for 12 hours a day, sitting behind a desk of computers and just running. That's no fun. That's what I mean by soul sucking. It just wasn't creative enough for me. That's why I left and went back to the craft world. In this industry here, I get the best of both worlds. I not only work for a large enough company where I make enough money to feed myself, but I also get the creative liberty to do whatever I want. As you guys will see later on, the 4 main beers that are served at this restaurant, well, this venue, which would be the Red, the Port Hoppin' IPA, the Java Stout, and the Caribbean Wheat. Those 4 beers are always here and available because they're printed on the menu. But also on the menu, you'll see something that says seasonal. Carnival gives us total creative liberty over that seasonal. Whatever I feel like making, it's totally dealer's choice. Anything I feel like making, they let me make, as long as those 4 other beers are here available for you. Does that make sense? That surrounds it. So in the same way, inside that hop cone is seeds and stems. They don't do much for me. But the flower that surrounds the seeds and stems give us bitterness and aroma. So the manufacturer of the hop strips all the flower off the hop cone and sends it to me in a pelletized format. They kind of look like little rabbit turds. And what I'm using little rabbit turds for is to generate bitterness and aroma in the beer. Now, bitterness comes from something called iso-alpha acid. The higher the level of alpha acid, the more bitterness I can get out of that hop. So I can change the variety of hop and the way I treat that hop and change how much bitterness I'm extracting from that hop. Also, there's lots of different aromatic compounds in different varieties of hops, and I can change the varietal of hop and therefore change the way the beer tastes and smells. Every letter in the alphabet, from A, like Amarillo, to Z, like Zeus, has at least one, if not multiple varietals associated with that letter. There's actually one varietal hop called the 7 C's. It's not 7 C's, it's the 7 C's. Like Centennial, Cascade, Calypso, they blend 7 C's varieties together and you get the 7 C's variety of hop. There's another one called Citra. Can you guess maybe what Citra might smell like? Citrus. We don't get real creative when we name stuff in beer. It smells like citrus, we call it Citra. Can you guess what color black malt is?
Yeah.
Black. Brown malt is? Honey malt tastes like? Biscuit malt smells like? You tracking? You following? Everybody cool? Alright, so I just gave you a hint. What's another ingredient? Wheat, or I called it malt. So we call it malt, but you could have said barley, you could have said wheat, you could have said rye, any cereal grain with the potential for sugar we can use to make beer from. Now the reason I'm calling it malt is we take that barley and we put it in a kiln. And the longer and hotter I bake it, the more of the sugar I turn into color. We call this a Maillard reaction. Have you ever baked a cookie or a birthday cake or biscuits and you cooked it a little bit too long? The longer and hotter you bake it, the browner it becomes. And the browner it becomes, the less sweet it tastes because you caramelize the sugar into color. So black malt gives me lots and lots of color, but almost zero sugar. Now that sugar is very important to me for one very, very important reason. Does anybody know what it is? Alcohol production. Without alcohol, beer is, well, it sucks. Would you guys be sitting here if I was serving O'Doul's? No. So it's very important that I create alcohol. Now for us, we're getting our alcohol production from cereal grain. We're getting the sugar from cereal grain. If I use honey for my sugar source, what beverage does honey make? Me. What beverage does grapes make? What beverage does apples make? Dextrose makes White Claw or Truly. There's no color, there's no aroma, there's no flavor. It just gives me sugar. And colorless beverage that's carbonated is called Truly. Does that make sense to y'all? So this is the definitional difference between beer and other beverages, is that we're using cereal grain for our sugar source. Is that tracking for everyone? Cool. So what's another ingredient? We now talked about malt, we've talked about hops, we've talked about, well that's it. What's another one? Water. Obviously the unsung hero in all beverage is water. Can we please all agree that it's fairly difficult to get liquid in a glass unless you put water in it? Please say yes. Good job. I'm glad we're all on that educational platform. Now what's important to us is the minerals that are broken down into the water. Now here on the ship, what water do you think I'm using to make the beer with? I'm using seawater. The ship brings that seawater in to cool the engines. It puts it through reverse osmosis and desalination, and it strips all the minerals out of the water. I then will add back minerals to build the water profile that I want for that particular beer. Now, as he can probably attest, most brewers will strip their water or use stripped water and build back the water profile. This is a whole lot easier for me to control the minerals that are in the water if I take everything out and I only add what I want back in. Now, when I'm talking about minerals, I'm talking about mineral salts, calcium sulfate, calcium chloride, zinc, magnesium. I'm going to build these things back because they hold on to different levels of protein. And that different level of protein creates something we call mouthfeel. Can you guess what mouthfeel is? It's the way it feels. I told you we don't get real creative when we name stuff in beer. It's the way it feels in your mouth. Now, what I'm talking about here is, you ever had a lager? You ever had a stout like Guinness? Do they feel different on your palate? That's because the viscosity of that liquid is different because the minerals have held on to more or less protein, and therefore I can change the mouthfeel by changing the water profile. Everybody good with that? Cool. Any questions so far? Change the way I treat that yeast and get different outcomes from the beer. So like if I ferment hotter using like a Belgian yeast strain, I'm going to get more ester and phenol production, and therefore you get more banana cloves. Think like Blue Moon or like a Belgian triple. Whereas if I use a lager strain that ferments slow and cold, I don't get that ester production, and therefore that beer is very clean and crisp. Does that make sense? So the lager, or the way I treat that yeast during fermentation, is going to be very important to the way that beer tastes and smells at the end. Everybody tracking on that? Okay, so now we've talked about water, we've talked about hops, we've talked about malt, and we've talked about yeast. Those four ingredients, those are the definition of beer. In Germany, they refer to it as the Reinheitsgebot. That's the German purity law. And it says they're only allowed to make beer using those ingredients. I don't know if you've ever hung out with any Germans, but they're not the most flexible people in the whole wide world. When they say only water, hops, malt, and yeast, they mean it. But Americans did what Americans do best. We got our hands on beer and we said, Katie, bar the door, if I want to put blueberries in my beer, by God, I will. Now, these other ingredients, we refer to them in the industry as adjuncts. And make flour out of it. I just want to crack the shell open so I can access what we call the pulp. That is the sugary stuff on the inside. Once it's ground up, we refer to it as grist, G-R-I-S-T, grist. If a brewer ever asks you for his grist bill, he's asking you for the recipe of your beer in terms of the grain that you're using to make it. We take that grist and we mix it with hot water. Does anybody know what the mixture of grain and hot water is called? Mash. Very good. So we're going to mix the mash in the first vessel that we call the mash mixer. Yay! No, or you can call it mash tun, depending on how old you are. But we're doing one very important thing in the mash tun. What I'm doing here is I'm using time and temperature to activate an enzyme called alpha and beta amylase. And what that thing does is it breaks down complex sugars into fermentable sugars. So imagine with me, if you will, that this table is a starch. It's a complex sugar. This is maltose, and this is maltose, and this is maltose. You're all maltose individually, but you're bound together by glycogen bonds. My little yeast friends think like Pac-Man. They can't eat this entire table put together. But if I break you off, and I break you off, and I break her off, you guys become fermentable sugars. That yeast can consume them and make alcohol. You three stay bound together. You're the residual sweetness that helps me balance the bitterness of the hop. Does that make sense? So the more sugar I break down, the more alcohol gets created, and the drier the final product is going to be because it has less sweetness to balance the flavor of the beer. Think like IPA. You're going to get a lot of forward or assertive bitterness because there's not a lot of sweetness that's balancing the bitterness of the hop. Or if you think like a pastry stout, you have a lot of sweetness, and so you get less bitterness because you're receiving more sweetness. That makes sense to you guys? Cool. Any questions so far? Now, we can do something that we call, just because he's here and he asked me this question earlier, we can do something called decoction mashes or decoction brewing, where I mash at different temperatures. And so I'm going to convert different sugars, and I'm also going to convert protein in a different way. We use this to get different styles of beer, like a hazy IPA or like a Belgian quad. You're getting different types of sugars broken down at different levels and different temperatures, and therefore that beer is going to come out drastically different. Everybody cool with that? Cool. So now we take the mash and we put it in the next vessel, which is called the lauter tun. The lauter tun is the exact same concept as your coffee maker at your house. When you make coffee, you take a coffee bean and you grind it up, right? Now you have coffee grounds. Then you take the coffee grounds and you put it in a basket or a strainer. And you use the strainer to filter away all the solids, and you only collect the liquid, because we don't like chewing on our coffee, yes or no? We also don't like chewing on our beer. So I use the lauter tun, has a flat stainless steel bottom that we call the false bottom. That acts like the filter paper in your coffee maker. It helps me separate all the solid away and only collect the liquid sugar water. Does anybody know what that liquid sugar water is called? It starts with a W. If you handle toads too much, you get them on your hands. Wort. So we pronounce it W-E-R-T. It's spelled W-O-R-T. The German word for it is like Wurstenflurgen or something like that. And we just jacked up the translation and we now call it wort. Now that wort is going to be collected into the boil kettle. Do you have a guess maybe what we might do in the boil kettle? We boil it. Now we're boiling it for three main reasons. The first reason is there's a chemical in all cereal grain that's called DMS. That stands for dimethyl sulfide. It smells a little bit like cream corn or corn chips. I don't have a problem with cream corn. I just don't like it in my beer. So the longer I boil it, the more of that DMS leaves with the steam. The second reason is I'm isomerizing alvacid. That's a very fancy way of saying I'm taking the bitterness out of the hop and I'm imparting it into the solution of the beer. So the longer I boil the hop, the more bitterness I extract from the hop. Does that make sense? You ever heard of Dogfish Head? You ever heard of 60-minute IPA? 90-minute IPA? 120-minute IPA? They don't change the recipe of the beer. They just boil it for 60, 90, or 120 minutes. They extract more of the bitterness so that beer gets more bitter the longer they boil it. Also, the alcohol goes up because you're boiling way more water in the form of steam. You condense the sugar, therefore you get more alcohol in the end. It's not rocket science, it's regular science. Everybody cool? Awesome. What's the most important reason I'm boiling the beer? Anybody watch Discovery Channel, Naked and Afraid, Dual Survival, Bear Grylls? So, hello. So if you're walking in the woods and you find a puddle of water and you're thirsty, you better boil that thing, yes or no? Because if you poop your pants until you meet Jesus, you're going to regret that decision, right? You don't want Giardia, you don't want Legionnaires, all this stuff. So I don't know what kind of microbes are hanging out in my kettle or in the pipes or on the hops or on the malt or on my hands. So I need to boil it so I have control over the micro that goes into that fermenter. Because unless I have control over that, have you ever had a Hefeweizen? Like Blue Moon? You ever had a lager? You ever had a sour beer? These are all fermented using different types of yeast or different microorganisms, and so therefore they change the way they smell and taste. So unless I kill everything, I don't know what's going to ferment the beer. So it's very important that I sterilize the beer by boiling it. Everybody cool with that? Now check this out. A lot of times your boil time, people will think that we boil for usually a minimum of 60 minutes. 60 minutes has nothing to do with the amount of time it takes to kill the microbes. It has more to do with the amount of DMS that's in the grain. You want to boil it for long enough to get rid of that DMS that we talked about. As long as you're boiling for like 5 minutes, you're going to kill all the microbes. But the DMS is really what's going to determine your boil time. So if you're using like Pilsner malt, German Pilsner has a very high load of DMS. It's not a fully modified malt. So you need to boil for like 90 minutes so you get rid of all that DMS. But if you do that, don't add your hops too early because it's going to contribute to the bitterness. Everybody tracking?
Are you talking residual bacteria that's in the tanks?
No, it's just residual bacteria that's existing in the pipes or in the kettle or on the grains. So I'm going to boil it before it ever gets to this because it needs to be sterile when it gets there. Cool? Awesome. So now we're going to talk about the fourth and final process in the brewing side, which is called the whirlpool. In the whirlpool, we whirl it around. Now we're only whirling it around for one reason. I got rid of all the solid grain, but now I put a bunch of solid hops. And I don't want the solid stuff in my beer because as we already talked about, we don't like chewing on our beer. So by spinning it, all the heavy stuff eventually will settle to the middle. We call this thing the true pot. The discharge port is on the side, therefore when I send it to the fermenter, I don't get any of that solid stuff. Now for all of you aspiring homebrewers out there, this is a great spot to add other stuff. Sweet orange peel, coriander, hibiscus petal powder, habanero pepper powder. If you do that, you better wear a mask. Trust me. You ever been CS Cast before? It makes a great beer, but you will snot from places you didn't know you could produce snot from. So, here's your quiz. Everything I just told you about, mash, lauter, boil, whirlpool, we refer to it as hot side. We call it hot because it's hot. It is going to go to cold side where it becomes cold. Now there's yeast on the cold side. If I put boiling hot stuff on top of the yeast, what happens to the yeast? I kill the yeast. If I kill the yeast, they can't produce alcohol. Without alcohol, beer sucks. Good job. So it's very important that I don't kill the yeast. So in between the hot side and the cold side is a very important piece of equipment, probably the unsung hero of the brewery. We call this thing the heat exchanger. The heat exchanger allows me to run cold medium over one side of some plates, hot medium over the other side of some plates. We exchange the heat between the two mediums, therefore the hot leaves cold and the cold stuff leaves hot. Here's the important thing. You do it sterilely, because once you've cooled it down, it's now susceptible to be re-inoculated with any micro that's hanging around. This is the part of the process where most homebrew guys mess up, because they take their Mr. Beer kit that they got for Father's Day from Books a Million in 1994, and they boil it in whatever means that they have available to them, which is generally like their grill or their wife's kitchen stove or whatever. And then they say to cool down this work as quickly as possible. The only way that most homebrew guys have to cool it down is to put an ice bath in the kitchen sink. And is that sterile?
Not necessarily.
And then it's going to get re-inoculated with all the micros that are in your kitchen, which is a lot of stuff. We refer to most of these micros as beer spoilers: Lactobacillus, Brettanomyces, Pediococcus, Diastaticus. They're not going to hurt you if you ingest them, but they're going to make your beer taste some way you don't want it to taste. This is why the guy at the end of the cul-de-sac that has like his homebrew kit, nobody wants to drink his beer because he's re-inoculated with all these beer spoilers and it smells more like banana than it does like hops. It makes sense, y'all? Everybody cool with that? All right, this is the part of the tour where Denny's going to bring us some Caribbean wheat. Yay! More beer. Now, Caribbean wheat, we ferment hot using a Belgian yeast strain, where you're going to get a lot of banana clove esters off of this. This is going to present to you much more like Brew. This is probably our second most popular beer on the ship. It just fits this environment very well.
What's this one you said?
Caribbean wheat. Wheat. Like you're hopping a little.
Sorry, I didn't mean to hit you.
Yes.
We're checking your pouring skills here. No pressure.
As the brew house, because historically speaking, this would be in a separate place. Imagine with me, if you will. Remember, I told you humans have been making beer for quite a long time, right? So imagine if, like, you live in England in a thatched roof hut in the 1600s. We call this what side? Hot side, because it's hot. If you want flammable or hot stuff in your flammable house, probably not a good idea. So they put it in a separate house. They call it the brew house. We keep just calling it that because we're lazy and we don't like to change what we call stuff. It's the same concept as the outhouse. You don't like the poo poo caca pee pee where you eat, so you put it in a separate place and you call it the outhouse. They didn't want to burn down their house, so they called it the brew house. Make sense? Yeah. There's a couple of very unique things about this particular brew house, other than the fact that it's on a cruise ship. And there's one thing that is glaringly, very visually obvious that makes it very unique. Anybody have a guess? It's made out of glass. There's only about 7 in the world that are made out of glass. They're custom made for us by a company in Munich, Germany called Albrecht Brewtechnik. And there's absolutely no good reason for it to be made out of glass. Almost every other brewery uses what material for their stainless steel? Because stainless steel is much more cost effective than this super thick tempered glass. But this is really cool. And Carnival likes cool stuff. So we bought a cool brewery to put on our cool cruise ship for no other reason than the fact that it's
cool.
Very good. So there's another very unique thing about this. How many processes did we talk about over there? Do you remember? 4. Mash, lauter, boil, whirlpool. How many vessels do you see here? 2. That's because I don't have a bunch of space on this ship to put a bunch of stuff. I combine the 4 processes into these 2 vessels. This is a combination system. So this is a mash, boil, lauter, whirlpool. So in Grand Cayman, whenever I make the beer here, I'm brewing in what port? Grand Cayman. It takes about 6-8 hours to make the beer, so don't carve out any portion of your day to solely dedicate it to watch me make this alcoholic soup. Just pass by at some point and you'll catch it. It's pretty cool to see. But in Grand Cayman, when I make the beer, I'm going to mix grain and water together over here to make mash. If you look at the bottom of that, you'll see a paddle, and I'm going to mix that mash. I'm mixing it because I don't want clumps. If I got clumps, I'm not getting contact with water. If I'm not getting contact with water, I'm not converting sugar. Without conversion of sugar, I don't get alcohol. Without alcohol, beer sucks. We covered this, yes?
Yes.
So, that's the mash tun. Then I'm going to put it over here into the lauter tun. If you look real close here, you'll see a flat stainless steel bottom. That's that false bottom we talked about, and that helps me strain away all the solid grain. Now what you're seeing here is what I'm doing is I'm pulling liquid off the bottom of this, and whenever you'll come see me brew, there'll be a layer of grain here. And I'm pulling the water off the bottom and circulating it back on the top to compact the grain bed so I can make what we call the filter bed. That helps me filter out more of the grain. Whenever this liquid starts coming clear, I know that I've got a good filter bed created, and then I can start transferring that work over into this vessel. Into this vessel, once it's full at the level I want it to be at for the batch size that I want, which generally here is about 400 liters. This is a 4 hectoliter system. So I'm brewing 400 liters at a time. Remember, this is German, so we're operating in metrics. You can think of it maybe like 150-ish gallons. So I'm brewing about 150 gallons. Once I collect that from this side, I'm then going to boil it. I'm going to add the hops. That extracts all the aroma and the bitterness. Now, here's another quiz for you. If I boil something and I don't ventilate the steam, now I have a bomb. Do we like bombs on cruise ships? No. So I need to ventilate my steam, but most breweries will ventilate their steam naturally through the roof. That's why we put stacks on top, because every other brewery in the entire world has stacks on top. We thought ours would look stupid if we didn't put stacks on top. But I can't ventilate my steam directly up, because what deck are we on? What's on deck 6? Rooms. What's on deck 7? More rooms. I can't ventilate my steam through 10 decks of people's cabins. So this is actually the ventilation system. If you listen, you hear that hum? That's air. It's an active ventilation system. It's always sucking air through the kettles, and it's still going out the stack at the top. I just have to force it to get there because of the construction of the ship. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. So now I take that work that I have the hops in, and I put it back into this vessel where I spin it around, around, around. It becomes the whirlpool. Now, what do you guys think happened to all the grain that was inside this vessel? Back in the day, we used to discharge it into what was called food pulpers. At that point, it's already started to ferment, and you can't feed cattle with it, because if the cows don't discriminate between fermented grain and non-fermented grain, if you don't know, they have like 87 stomachs or something, and then they'll get blowed up, and the farmers get pissed off at us. So we try not to piss off farmers. Everybody cool? Awesome. So this is where we separate the grain and the hops away. We spin it around, around, around. In the case of this beer, I add sweet orange peel and coriander, which makes it a wit style of beer. And then I put it into one of those fermentation tanks. In a minute, we're going to go over there and talk more in depth about fermentation. But do I have any questions as it pertains to this?
Does sunlight have any impact with this beer?
That's a great question. So the enemy of packaged beer, as we're about to talk about, is oxygen and UV light strike. That's why every beer that's in a glass bottle that's clear was designed to be shite. You ever drink a Corona? What do you always add to a Corona? Because it tastes like very good. So, the darker the glass, the more UV light strike you prevent. That's in packaged beer. Before in the brewing process, the light really doesn't make any difference to us. So that's why we can get away with it being clear on this side, but that's why all of those are still stainless, because their light strike is very important.
Okay, so it's
Post this. Yes, ma'am. Because what is affected by UV light strike is isomerized alpha acid. So whenever the alpha acid from the hops hit UV light strike, it deteriorates. That's what creates skunky flavor in beer. At this point, I don't have all that much UV light strike occurring in isomerized alpha acid, but over here I've got lots. Make sense?
Yes.
Questions, comments, concerns? All right, let's go drink more beer. A lot of times we refer to this room as the cellar. That's because, again, historically speaking, this would be in a cellar. Because temperature control during fermentation is probably the most important thing about fermentation. You must regulate the temperature of the yeast so that you can regulate the action of the yeast. Back in the day, the only way they had to regulate temperature was to put it in the earth, use the earth to insulate it, and therefore they called it the cellar, because it was quite literally in the cellar. These days, we're not using the earth to insulate. What we're using is all these fancy tanks. Now, these fancy tanks are called conical fermenters because they have cones at the bottom, and inside we are fermenting. Now, what's happening in here is is the sugar water that I produce out there, I direct into one of these tanks with one of those big rubber hoses back there. And when the sugar water gets introduced to the yeast start to eat the sugar, yes?
Yes.
They get real excited when they get to eat. The same way that you guys get excited when y'all go to Lido and start feeding your face. Now sometimes you go a little crazy up at the Lido bar and you get yourself a tum-tum ache, you get the meat sweats, you make yourself upset. When the yeast make themselves upset, they produce what we call off flavors. We call them off flavors because they're off. We don't want off flavors. So what I do is I set the temperature of the tank to fermentation temp. Usually somewhere between like 50 and 73 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the style of yeast and the type of beer I'm trying to make. That tank is basically a really fancy Yeti cup. It's a double jacketed stainless steel tank. And instead of air being the insulator like in your Yeti cup, what's running into the jacket space is a substance called propylene glycol. It's coming into this room at like -3 degrees Celsius, which is really, really cold. So when I set the fermentation temp to, let's say, 20 degrees Celsius, and the yeast get excited, they heat the tank to 20.1 degrees Celsius, the automatic glycol valve that's on the top of the tank flashes that really cold glycol into the jacket space, and it tells the yeast inside, like, hey, calm down there, Bubba. And they say, okay. And they sink back down to the bottom of the tank. Then they start eating again. And then we flash the jacket again, and we're just regulating the action of the yeast by regulating the temperature of the tank. Does that make sense to all of you?
Yes.
So my job is to measure the sugar. Because obviously, as the yeast consume the sugar number is going to drop. We refer to this as the Plato. So the Plato is going, or the Brix, depending on what system you like to work in. So that Plato number is going to drop. Let's say it starts off at a 10. And day number 1 of fermentation, it's a 9. And then it'll be like a 7.5. Then it'll be a 6. And eventually it's going to repeat. What that indicates to me is all the fermentable sugars that I created out there have now been consumed. The only thing remaining is the non-fermentable sugars. Those yeast cannot eat those sugars. What happens to you if you cease eating? You die. And when you die, you will make off flavors. Every living organism on the face of this planet produces off flavors when it ceases to exist. We don't want off flavors in the beer. So what I do, what does that tank say behind you? What does that red number say? 3.4. So I cool the temperature of the tank down just above freezing. What that does is it puts the yeast in a dormant phase. It slows their metabolism so they don't need to eat as much. It also forces all the solids, the hops, the yeast, down into the bottom of the cone. That's the reason for the geometry of that cone, is I can use that geometry to then dump the yeast off the bottom or reharvest the yeast into another tank. I do like to reharvest my yeast. That's because yeast get better at making beer the longer that they make it. Think about it like this. You guys have kids?
Yes.
Were your kids good at being human beings when they were infants? Like if you take a newborn and just plop it down in the woods, is it going to live by itself?
No.
Probably not. The yeast don't make beer on generation 1, but they make it slower. They make more off flavors. They make more mistakes. But then in the middle of their lives, generation 3, 4, 5, now they're in their mid-30s. They're doing brewery tours on a cruise ship. They kind of got their life together. And then eventually they start doing weird old people stuff. And we say, hey, thanks for your service, ciao. Now, unfortunately for them, this is their retirement home. So when we get done with the yeast, we just dump it down the drain. Now, it does throw off our pH of our water a little bit. And what I do is I run a 3-step cleaning process on all this stuff. The first is something we call caustic or PBW. This is a heavy alkaline solution. You can think of it kind of like a really strong Dawn dish soap. That removes organic material. The second is a phosphoric acid cycle. That removes what's called beer stone. That's the mineral deposit left behind by those mineral salts that we talked about. Think of it sort of like really strong CLR. The third thing is our sanitizing cycle. We use peroxytic acid here because we don't like killing people. What happens to you if you drink bleach? We don't like killing folks, right? So we use PAA instead as a sanitizer. That's a non-rinse solution at the proper titration. That way I don't need to rinse the tank and expose it to more elements. I can just leave it sealed up whenever I get done sanitizing. Make sense?
Yes.
That acid also neutralizes the basic yeast, and so therefore I reset our water pH. There you go. Sorry, I had a brain fart. There we go. Everybody good?
Yeah.
Cool. So that side of the room is fermentation tanks, FVs. You always know a fermentation tank because it has a cone shape at the bottom. What do these have what do these lack that those have? That's because all the solid material has been left behind over there, so I don't need the cone shape on the bottom of this. These are serving vessels. In the industry, we refer to them as bright beer tanks. Bright beer in the beer industry is known as what we call carbonated, fermented, ready for service beer. That clicking sound that you guys have been hearing, these tanks are hooked directly to those taps out there. So when y'all order a beer from here, that clicking sound, someone's getting a beer right now. As a matter of fact, it's this beer. See the pipe shaking? Oh, it stopped. But anyway, so how many tanks are on this side of the room? Three. How many taps do I have outside? 4. 8. So I keg some of my beers directly off the fermenter because I only have 3 service tanks. Cool? Cool. So let's talk about one last thing. This is going to get kind of weird. Remember I told you, how many of you guys have noticed that IPAs tend to be higher in alcohol?
Yes.
And stouts tend to be higher in alcohol?
Yes.
Porters, higher. Brown ales, higher. But lagers, pilsners, kolsches, there's not a lot of flavor in a pilsner or a kolsch that's going to help me hide fermentation errors. But I can hide fermentation errors with hops, with coffee, with cocoa nibs. So I can use the big, bold aromas and flavors of those darker, bigger beers to hide fermentation errors. Now, here's why this is important for you to understand. Every living organism on the face of this planet is trying to accomplish one singular goal. Do you know what it is? Reproduce. We want to ensure the survival of our species by reproducing. Yes?
Yes.
Now, in order to reproduce, you need to have energy. And you produce energy by eating. So you eat so you can produce energy so you can reproduce. Yes? Now, the yeast are doing the same thing. But whenever you eat so you can produce energy, you also produce some byproducts. What's in your glass right now is fungus juice, fungus sweat, and fungus poo pee. Now, for us, alcohol is desirable. CO2 is desirable. So I'm using the CO2 that they produce to carbonate the beer. But the higher the level that alcohol goes, the more the yeast get angry because they don't like being in that high alcohol environment. So then they start fighting back and producing off flavors. Those are what I refer to as fermentation mistakes, and I can cover those fermentation mistakes with the flavor of hops. That's why you're never going to see a lager that's 10% alcohol. And if you do, don't drink it because it's going to taste like crud. But you can drink a double IPA that's 10% alcohol because the flavor of the hops is going to mask the off flavors that they produce by being in that higher alcohol environment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. This is why a lot of times if someone asks, like, let's say, who opened the brewery? I forget who I chose. Who opened the brewery? So I called on somebody and said, you opened a brewery? Yeah, either way, whatever. Somebody opens a brewery in your local hometown. If you don't trust their brewing process, order their IPA or their stout. If you trust their brewing process, order their lager or their pilsner. Because you're going to taste all the bad mistakes that they made in that lager or a pilsner, but you're not going to taste it in a porter or a stout. Does that make sense to you all?
Yes.
Cool. Also, you know, porter or stout probably get you where you're going faster. Okay, there you go. All right, any questions for me over here?
Yes. No.
Shoot.
You got 3 tanks, four different taps, right?
Yep.
Where's the, it's not for the four, where's your seasoning? Where are you making it?
I keg it directly from the fermenter
Okay.
in one of these little kegs.
Do you age any of your high alcohol beers?
I do, which